All right, everybody, I think we're going to get started now. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us for the sixth and final iteration of our What is the Urban Now series, celebrating 50 years of urban studies at Brown. I'm so pleased to see everyone here and for everyone to be here for our final conversation in this series. I think many of you have attended earlier versions of this and have seen the kinds of things we've been trying to do this year to launch a series, to have a series talking about the largest issues facing cities and in terms of thinking about urbanization today. So across the course of this year, we've had 5 conversations. With Neil Brenner was our opening conversation about climate change and planetary urbanization and the challenges facing cities and city dwellers in a time of climate catastrophe and climate awareness. We followed that with a conversation between our colleague Lauren Yap and Aiwa Ong about the informal life of Asian and Global South cities. And we heard from Robert Sampson in conversation with our colleague Josh Pashevitz about the persistence of neighborhood life particularly in United States cities, and the neighborhood effect, the concept that he has done so much to discover and promote. This semester, we heard from 2 experts in questions about justice in cities. Our colleague Rebecca Carter was in conversation with Tony Griffin from the Harvard GSD, whose work on the concept of the just city and her work with organizations in planning for just cities was an inspiration, I know, to many of our students. And then our colleague Theo Wickland was in conversation with Ananya Roy from UCLA, who talked to us about spatial justice in cities, and particularly her work with tenant organizations and other organizations in Los Angeles and Chicago and in India, thinking about how to empower ordinary citizens to make spatial justice. And today I think we're particularly pleased to close out with our colleague and many of our longtime interlocutors, Tom Sugrue, joining us from NYU. Professor Morone will have more to say about Professor Sugrue, but I'm particularly pleased that he's closing out this series because I think Professor Sugrue's ideas, his work, have been particularly inspirational to me and to many of my generation of urbanists. I often tell students that there are 2 books that inspired me to become someone who was interested in cities. Those were Mike Davis's City of Quartz and Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts into Air. It is, however, Tom's Origins of the Urban Crisis that I discovered in my first year of graduate school that made it clear to me that there was a whole lot more to be done, that there was a whole another level to take this kind of work to try to understand the cities that I had grown up with in the 1970s and 80s. The places that had essentially birthed me were places that I thought I understood. When I read Origins, I realized there was a whole other set of things to try to understand, a whole new set of stories and ways of seeing the urban history of the 20th century in ways that I had not yet understood. We'll talk quite a bit more about this, I am sure, today. So it's a real pleasure for me to bring our celebration of 50 years of urban studies to a close with someone who has helped us to see so much about the last 50 years of cities and really launched all kinds of work about that. I mean, I know my colleague Robert Self, who's here with us today, would say the same about thinking about the last 50 years of urban history and connecting it to our various urban presents. So this is important to us. And it's really fitting, too, I think, because this program, the Brown Urban Studies program, was founded in 1971-ish, depending on how you look at it. Maybe 72, maybe 73, somewhere in there, depending on how you tell that story. But it was founded during the period that Tom's Origins of the Urban Crisis was about. It was that era of so-called urban crisis. Many programs in urban studies were founded during this period. It was at a time, of course, when cities were seen as a kind of source of special concern. Cities were seen to be the source of so-called urban problems, right? Deindustrialization, poverty, segregation, racial strife, suburbanization, the flight of people and capital, particularly white people and capital that served white people, away from cities. And we still live in the long tail of all those issues, and I think that's something we'll talk about quite a bit today. But for the last few decades, those older concerns were filtered through a sort of different story, one of so-called urban resurgence and urban revival. This threw up all kinds of new problems: gentrification, displacement, racialized policing, sprawl, many of which were themselves reformulations of old problems that were germane to American cities, but also to cities around the world. But they were also understood in many ways through the lens of the idea that cities were not themselves a source of those problems, but a source of inspiration and hope for solutions to such issues. This was sort of a hopeful time, I think, in urban studies. And also the effects of that way of thinking still linger, too. But today I think we find ourselves at the beginning, or several years perhaps, into yet another time, one that is not yet so easily defined, one that's not yet so easily made into a category for our easy carrying away, I think. A period when big cities have started to price themselves out of the kinds of vibrancy and success that once defined them, and climate change and global pandemic have thrown all the previous sureties up in the air, and we're in some ways having to rethink the history and present of urbanism for a new time. So over the course of this year, as I suggested, that's what we've been trying to do, and to try to get at how it is that new conditions are reformulating the older issues of urban inequality, urban conflict that we once thought of as formally and purely structuring urban history and urban life. And I think there's no one who's probably more equipped to help us to do that and to think about those problems than Tom Sugrue. So let me turn it over to my colleague Jim Morone. This is a wonderful moment, I think, also for Professor Morone. I understand this is the last week of his city politics course that's just ending this day, right? So I'll give a round of applause for that Brown institution. And I know you've been celebrating that a lot in class, and we're here to help keep that celebration going, right, as Jim and Tom talk about the last 50 years of urban politics, the present, and the future. So over to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Sandy, and welcome everybody to this celebration of urban studies, and welcome especially to Tom, who's an old friend, and Sandy really put it beautifully when he said his career has been reimagined by Tom Sugrue. He's really rethought what urban history, urban racial history, the American urban experience is all about, defining and redefining the field over his career. I count 9 books. I'm probably behind the times, but I count 9 books of his, most of which are on my shelves, but they're about urban life, about race, about opportunity and immigration and real estate, and how the local shapes the national and the national reverberates onto the local. The book that Sandy mentioned, I just want to read you the number of awards this book won. It may be a partial list. This will really embarrass you. Winner of the Bancroft Prize, the Philip Taft Prize, the President's Book Award, Social Science History Association, the best book in North American urban history from the Urban History, and one of Choice's outstanding academic titles for 1967. I saw a couple more online, but I'd better stop there or you'll start to get embarrassed. I would also point out Sweet Land of Liberty, which generations of city politics students at Brown have read and loved. A book called Not Even Past, quoting Faulkner to describe Barack Obama. And while in between these many books and these field redefining works, he wins teaching awards. Any more, and I'll be accused of going over the top. So let me just say, what a pleasure it is to have you here. Welcome to Brown, and I'll ask a bunch of questions, and Tom will answer, and we'll go back and forth a little bit, but then we're going to turn it over to you. So get your questions ready. I won't cold call you this time round, but I do hope that you'll engage in this conversation too. Let me just start with the obvious question. How did you get into this racket?
Oh. That's a really good question, Jim. But before I get into how I got on this record, I just want to thank you for helping me at an early stage in my career when I was just getting my feet wet as an urbanist and as a scholar. I think it was the first invited lecture that I gave as a young assistant professor here at Brown, the Charles Culver Lecture in Urban Studies in 1994. I was barely over 30, and I didn't have much gray hair, and Jim invited me here to talk to a group of scholars and faculty like this, but also to come to your urban politics class, which was a real treat. I'm jealous that many of you had the opportunity to do this class. I wish I had had the opportunity to sit through an entire semester of that course as well. So it's really a treat to be here, and thanks, Andy, too, for setting up the visit. So, how did I get into this business? Our projects generally have some element of autobiography in them. When I wrote Origins of the Urban Crisis, I was very shy about revealing my relationship to the subject I wrote about. Origins is a book about Detroit. Detroit's my hometown. I grew up in Detroit in a very complicated period of the city's history. I didn't talk about my origins in Detroit in the book because I was worried that readers would say, oh, this is just some guy offering maudlin reflections on his own city, or they would see me as a narrow-cast local historian. And I believe in local history. I think it's critical for scholars to engage place and locality as a lens to getting to bigger issues. But I didn't want to be Dr. Detroit. I didn't want to be the guy who wrote a little local case study of interest only to local historians. I wanted to engage really big questions. But growing up in Detroit did shape my choice of subjects. My earliest memories in Detroit were living in a neighborhood that was affected by the transformations that I would write about. I didn't have the vocabulary as an urbanist, of course, as a kid, to understand what was going on. But my neighborhood went from being all white to all black in a period of about 4 years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. My 5th birthday was the Detroit Uprising of 1967. I wouldn't have remembered it except for the fact that my parents took me down to the end of our block where we saw a parade of National Guard vehicles, personnel carriers, jeeps, etc., rolling by, which for a 5-year-old boy was pretty cool. But as I lived in metropolitan Detroit, moving to the suburbs as a kid, yanked from what I saw is the idyllic neighborhood of my youth into a very white, very homogeneous, and sometimes very racist suburban place. I began to think more systematically about the relationship between the city and the suburbs, and began more systematically to think about the place. I decided to get out of the Midwest and go to New York. And of course, I walked into a city in New York in the early 1980s where I started college that was also an immensely complicated place. One of my classmates at Columbia, he was actually a year older than me, was Barack Obama, who described during his time at Columbia how New York was in a state of what he called tribal warfare. It was a place where there were bitter recriminations. It's a place that was plagued by disinvestment, where buildings on the Upper West Side, where Columbia was, were being torched by landlords who collected insurance, where single-room occupancy hotels were springing up, where homelessness was ubiquitous. All of those experiences, both growing up in Detroit in a racially polarized city and witnessing it and not understanding it, living in New York in a really defining moment in the city's history and in American history, all of those are kind of the biographical, autobiographical underpinnings of Origins. But by the late 1980s, when I began working on the project, there weren't many historians thinking about this period. Most historians were writing about the 19th century, and I trained primarily as a 19th century historian. But I sniffed that there was something important to be said about the 20th century. At that time, the folks who were asking interesting questions about cities and who were influencing the larger public debate on urban life, on race and inequality, on poverty and politics were social scientists, primarily sociologists and political scientists. I like to say, with all due respect to my political science friend to my right, social scientists ask really good questions. But historians give really good answers. And so when I started with Origins, I engaged a couple of different bodies of scholarship coming out in that period that were grappling with the so-called urban underclass. That is, what explains concentrated, persistent, racialized poverty in our cities. This was a hot and intense debate in the 1980s, dominated by scholars from the center to the right of the political spectrum. Charles Murray, for example, some of you may know his work, wrote a very influential book in the 1980s in which he argued that it was the perverse incentives of welfare that sapped people's work ethic and led to the collapse of urban economies and urban vitality. More to the left, there was a group of economists, political economists and sociologists who wrote about deindustrialization and globalization. And they said, no, it's not the perverse incentives of welfare, it's the profound transformation of the global economy in the 1970s, the oil shocks, the globalization of industry, and deindustrialization. So as I was thinking about what to write about for a dissertation, I thought about these works, and I decided that I could bring a historical perspective to what they were saying about cities. At the same time, there was also a really critical debate that was playing out largely in the pages of middle-brow political periodicals like, say, The New Republic. They were related to the scholarship on the underclass, but they focused largely on racial division, right? The 1980s was a period of really intense racial struggle. And a lot of the reporting was about New York City. It was about blacks and Jews colliding on the streets of places like Crown Heights in Brooklyn. It was about the attack on some African American kids who made their way into all-white Howard Beach in New York. It was about the former white working class neighborhoods of Canarsie and places like that in Brooklyn that were now full of angry Italians and Jews who saw blacks as destroying their city. And it was a period when prominent pundits, still a very prominent pundit, Thomas Edsall and others, were looking at the rise of the Reagan Democrats. And all of them made a pretty similar set of arguments. The poisonous racial politics, quote, identity politics of the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s had created bitter divisions in American society, and all of these contributed to the crisis that cities were facing. So I'm reading all this stuff, and I decided I'm going to engage them by actually going back into the archives and exploring these questions. And what I found there confounded most of this conventional wisdom. First, it was very clear to me that to understand the question of urban poverty was to have to look at the macroeconomy, right? We had to look at the larger transformations that were reshaping metropolitan America. In that respect, the political economists, the folks on the left who were writing about deindustrialization, had something right. But the folks who are writing about deindustrialization overlook the fact that this is a process that wasn't just a consequence of globalization. It wasn't just a consequence of the oil shocks of the 1970s and beyond. It wasn't the uncompetitiveness of the American auto industry in Detroit compared to what was happening in Europe and in Asia. I found, when I got to the archives, that the racial division of the 1980s and 1990s wasn't anything new. It was very deeply rooted. Not rooted in the politics of the 1960s and the rise of a new right, but rooted in the New Deal, rooted in the politics of America in its supposedly social democratic heyday in the middle of the 20th century. And so what did I find? To put it really briefly, I found that the process of racial division was central to local and urban politics from the 1930s at least the 1930s on forward. Even in places like Detroit that were liberal, that were the home of a very powerful and progressive labor movement, even there, racial politics were poisonous, bitter, and reshaped and intensified segregation in housing and in labor in the metropolitan area. Secondly, I found that the process of deindustrialization, or the flight of capital and disinvestment from cities, wasn't a distinctive product of the 1970s. It was really, really deeply rooted in the post-Second World War II period. So Detroit lost 130,000 manufacturing jobs between 1948 and 1963. In other words, the 50s. This is when there was no international competition in the auto industry. This is when the United States was unchallenged globally, and the auto industry was at its peak of power and influence. It employed 1 in every 6 working Americans, directly or indirectly. And so once you begin taking a look at the history of business and the economy in the city in that period, you see a pattern that would continue in the 1970s and beyond. The search for cheap labor. The flight of industry to low-wage regions in other parts of the Midwest, in other parts of the United States, and eventually in the 1970s and beyond in other parts of the world. And then I found, taking a look at the political question, I found that, and I argued pretty forcefully in Origins, that the urban politics of the New Deal were prefigurative of the racial divisions that would play out in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. To point one's finger, as many scholars were doing, and still many do. I mean, this idea that somehow the 60s are to blame, or Black Power and identity politics are to blame for racial divisions and political division and polarization in the United States, it's still really deeply rooted. It's still out there in the conventional wisdom that shapes politics and punditry and journalism about American politics. It's baked into liberalism itself. It's there at the creation. It's not something that is a consequence of, quote, backlash, a commonly used term that I think profoundly miscasts the nature of urban politics and of racial politics in American cities. And so that's a long answer to your question, but it was really my attempt to engage a series of contemporary debates. And then ultimately, research does what research does. You find stuff you didn't expect, right? You end up going in directions that you hadn't anticipated when you started the project. And certainly my scholarship followed that trajectory. I'd say one last thing. If your scholarship, whether it be a paper for Professor Morone's class, or whether it be a dissertation, or whether it be a book, if you start off that project with an idea about what happened, and you end up with exactly that same thing in your head, you've done something wrong. The archives, the research process is always full of surprises.
Wow, wonderful. A wonderful, you see what I mean, right? This wonderful description of all of urban political history in a first statement. Let me ask you to think a little bit about the Black reaction, making African Americans subject. You've got much to say about this. Subjects of the battles, as well as those acted on by whites, and pulling back a little bit. So there's a double question. Maybe putting it in the context. This is a talk about what is the urban now. Let's go back in a time machine. It's 1967. Their hair is a lot longer. Malcolm, you've got short hair by the 1967 standards. I've got a lot more myself. What is the urban now? 1967. And with a particular emphasis on how Black activism looks. But more generally, what would you have said if you were in this room back then about what the urban is now?
That's a really good question. I guess it's a question of what an urbanist in 1967 would say. That is putting my head in the spirit of, I don't know, Edward Banfield or Elliot Lebo or someone like that.
See, I've got some tobacco here for you.
Yeah. I don't. Yes, exactly. I don't want to channel them, I think, but rather I'll follow your question and place 2023 me blasted through a time machine into 1967. And what might I say? I would look out onto American cities in the 1960s at that critical moment of the formation of urban studies programs, and explain what was happening in the long, hot summers of rebellion. Beginning in 1963, intensifying in 64 and 65, even more in 1966, and culminating in 1967 when 163 American cities, suburbs, and small towns exploded in protest and uprising, or what were called the riots of the 1960s. I would apply my skills as a historian, the tools of my research and what I found to try to make sense out of what was happening in the streets. At that time, the conventional wisdom was, to use Edward Banfield, the famous political scientist, it was rioting for fun and profit. It was a nihilistic outburst of youthful excess on the streets of American cities. For some, it was the beginning of revolution. This was a moment when protests and social movements, largely based in cities, were challenging institutions, authority, and the status quo. And to folks on the left, the urban rebellions of the 1960s were a sign that we were finally coming to that revolutionary moment when white supremacy and economic injustice were going to be overthrown, and new bottom-up grassroots participatory institutions would take their place. Right? For the right, it was apocalypse. It was a moment of lawlessness, of disorder, of disaster. It was something that required fierce punishment, federal intervention, even military intervention if necessary, to put down this unrest and to restore a putatively orderly society that had existed before. I would pop down into that moment and say, we need to understand what's happening in the streets of our cities and suburbs and small towns in terms of a long unaddressed history of racial inequality, and in particular issues that are central to defining the experience of people of color living in American cities. I didn't write about this much in Origins of the Urban Crisis, but I would if I were to rewrite the book now, or if I were back in my time machine to 1967. I would turn toward the question of policing. Something now that we have 10, 15 years of pretty amazing historical scholarship on, bringing the question of policing, imprisonment, and the carceral state to the center of our story of modern American history. Commentators in 1967 talked about policing, and some highlighted problems of police brutality, but most saw policing as, to use the language of the time, as a spark that set off the disturbances. But it was a spark with a lot of kindling underneath. There was other stuff. They overlooked the ways in which urban life in the post-Second World War II period was profoundly defined by the policing of racial boundaries, the policing of neighborhood transformation, the significant expansion of police powers in a period of racial transformation in cities. I knew this when I wrote Origins, but I wasn't fundamentally interested in the question of policing. But one of the aha moments I had in the archives was I was using the NAACP, which is a major civil rights organization in the country at that time, the Detroit branch of the NAACP papers. And there were a couple of boxes, big file boxes, full of police brutality and police harassment complaints. They were closed. I asked the archivist if I could get permission to open them up and look in them. And I did, and it was an eye-opening set of discoveries, which is most of them dated from the 1940s and the 1950s and the early 1960s. This was a moment when Detroit's police force, like police forces all around the country, were between 90 and 100% white. Detroit's was, I think, in 1967, about 95% white, in a city that was getting close to, was more than 40% black. So there is already a profound imbalance in the process of policing. there was essentially no recourse to these letters that were written to the NAACP. But I open up one file, and it's a black woman who's walking with her friends in their Sunday best to church, and a cop car drives by, and the white police officer shouts the N-word out the window. A little indignity, right? It's not a major incident, but they're upset. It's a Sunday morning. They're on their way to church. Again and again and again, I found examples of black men in the, quote, wrong place at the wrong time, which meant driving a car or stopping in a predominantly white section of the city, and then being pulled out of their car, pushed up against a wall, often pretty seriously beaten, taken to jail, and charged with disorderly conduct or resisting the police or some other fairly dubious charge. Again and again, file folder after file folder. At that point, it was very, very difficult to win any redress in complaining against the police. The NAACP didn't have the clout. There were very few black elected officials who were sympathetic to their arguments. The police department didn't have any internal mechanisms to investigate these charges. So essentially, they were crying for help. And the NAACP was carefully chronicling them and doing what it could, sending letters of complaint to the police department or to various city agencies. So what we see, in other words, is the process of housing segregation that I described in Detroit was one that was also being accomplished and reinforced by police activity. Often, and this is something I've argued against in all of my work pretty much, often Americans describe the process of residential segregation by race as the expression of market choices. Birds of a feather flock together. People live in neighborhoods because they choose to be with people like themselves. Or, and I've written about this myself, we talk about real estate industry policies or federal housing policies that deliberately segregated our metropolitan areas by race and sometimes by ethnicity. These are all true. But what I didn't truly account for when I was writing Origins was the role that policing played in maintaining those invisible lines that separated black and white, that separated neighborhoods in the city. And it proves to be a really consequential reality. So in 1967, you have folks who have been politicized by ongoing incidents of police brutality around the country, right? The black newspapers in cities all around the country are covering police brutality incidents constantly. They're not being covered by white newspapers. They're almost invisible in the white press, but they're being covered by the black press. And then the civil rights struggle, mostly in the South in this period, gets massive news coverage, and we see Bull Connor and Lori Pritchett and the other figures of white law enforcement in the South using their power to put down segregationist protest. There's a lot of anger building. And what happens in every one of these uprisings, there may be a few that don't follow this pattern, but nearly all of them, the hundreds that happened in the 1960s, are almost all started by a conflict between an African American and the police. Sometimes it's rumor. In Philadelphia, folks said a pregnant woman had been arrested, beaten, and killed by the police. And others, it was folks gathering, witnessing a stop. In Chicago in 1966, it was a bunch of kids playing in a fire hydrant, which you do in the summer in the city when it's hot, and you don't have public pools or other facilities, and getting arrested for so doing. On it goes. But what happens there is you see the seeds of discontent and of political organizing around questions of the police that go back to the 1940s and 1950s that are shaping what's going on in the 1960s. So I would say, more emphatically than my 1967 counterpart would, we've got to deal with the ways in which policing is essential to the racialization of metropolitan space and maintaining a status quo that is to the benefit of white property owners, of whites generally, in ways that need to be recognized. Unfortunately, I'm building now on my 1967 self is building on the work of amazing scholars like Simon Balto at the University of Wisconsin, who's written a magnificent field-defining history of the Chicago Police Department, exploring all these issues and many, many more.
To give you a moment to rest, there's a wonderful story that reflects, not a wonderful, it's a horrible story that wonderfully reflects what you just said. There was a terrible race riot in Detroit in 1943, and this one, whites are running amok. And at one point, they're taking African Americans off streetcars to pummel and in some cases kill them. And the head of the NAACP, a man named White, who's very light-skinned and can pass as white, dashes out to Detroit and is on a streetcar. And suddenly the police stop the streetcar and get on it and say, okay, we'll take you to safety. So just the opposite of what you're saying. The cops meaning to save the black riders on the streetcar. And White writes that they heard the people off the car in a phalanx and then step aside and with sneers almost invite the crowd to attack the people they've pretended to defend. So incredibly cynical. He stands, White is still on the car watching this as the crowd descends on these people, and the cops just stand aside and almost seem to enjoy the spectacle. Mm-hmm. So the very idea of the police protecting, as you say, is kind of turned on its head in this grisly way. All right, that's enough of a break for you. You have a marvelous, and to me, I didn't know this, description of Martin Luther King looking to take the civil rights movement north. And he looks at New York, biggest city, well, it's not going to work. And he looks at Philadelphia, it's not going to work. And he's looking for a city. Would you describe, one, how Martin Luther King picked Chicago for his crusade, and why not New York? It was the largest city at the time. And secondly, how you reread the civil rights movement when you look at it from a northern lens. How, we all know the story of Bull Connor, as you just said. What stories do we learn by looking at civil rights and the civil rights movement in the North rather than in the South?
I'll start with the second question and then go back to the first, because I think it helps to contextualize it. But after writing Origins of the Urban Crisis, I decided to focus on black resistance to the transformations, the issues I described in Origins. I'd been thinking about this for a while, but there was one review of Origins came out. It got lots of great reviews. I mean, I really couldn't have asked for better reviews. But I got one by a very prominent Detroit-based activist, longtime ally of the Black freedom struggle, called Grace Lee Boggs. Some of you may have heard of her. If you haven't heard of her, look her up. She's quite amazing. She was a longtime intellectual. Got a PhD in philosophy as a Chinese American woman from New York in the 1930s, and became part of a left labor civil rights nexus, and was central to labor struggles in the 1940s and 1950s, to the rise of Black power in Detroit in the 1960s. When the FBI investigated Grace Lee Boggs and her husband, Jimmy Boggs, who was an Alabama-born Black auto worker, an organic intellectual in the struggle, they assumed that she was Black. Because of her politics and because of her associations, and indeed every major figure in the Black Power movement spent time with Grace and Jimmy Boggs in Detroit in the 1960s and 1970s. So anyway, Grace Lee Boggs reviews Origins, which led my ears to perk up. I mean, it's like, whoa, this is wasn't I was expecting. It wasn't just some professor from in urban history from some university. And the title of her review summarized what I'd already begun to think. It's called "Where Are the People?" In other words, when I was writing about structural transformations in the city, deindustrialization, workplace discrimination, disinvestment, and politics, By and large, I didn't write about the massive movements that arose in Detroit and elsewhere to challenge that status quo. And so Grace gave me maybe a kick in the pants, or at least reinforced my kind of developing decision that I wanted to write about this. We tell the story of the Black freedom struggle largely from the South, right? It begins in 1954-55. It follows the arc of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And organizations he was associated with, and it ends around 1968, usually with a tragic denouement, which is the civil rights movement was accomplishing great things, and then these angry Black Power advocates and urban rioters came in and blew up the dream. And the North usually figures in there. That's where the North shows up. The North shows up as the graveyard of the civil rights movement's dreams. The movement went north, the argument goes, and everything came apart. There's a lot to be said for the appeal of that narrative of the civil rights movement. It's a really powerful story, right? It's also a story that speaks to some very deep themes in American political culture. It's a redemption story. It's a Christian story of suffering, of martyrdom, of redemption. We overcame, the argument goes, as a result of the movement. But if we turn our attention to the North, the story is, and even to the South, the story is a longer one, it's a deeper one, it's a messier one, and it's one that gets overshadowed by our focus on one region. King himself, again and again, argued that the Black freedom struggle is a national struggle, not just a regional or southern struggle. And so when I began investigating the North, I found really an extraordinary and mostly unknown, mostly forgotten history of grassroots activism, largely based in cities and some small cities and small towns, which was an interesting discovery. I can talk more about that later if you'd like. But ultimately, I looked at the ways in which folks organized and challenged the exclusion from the labor market and discrimination, how they challenged policing, how they challenged segregated housing, how they challenged separate and unequal education, how they challenged northern Jim Crow. And northern cities were as exclusionary for the most part as their southern counterparts. Restaurants, movie theaters, shops and stores, hotels, etc., excluded African Americans pretty completely, despite the lack of local ordinances that we had in the South that managed Jim Crow. And so I began digging, looking at all sorts of local struggles all over the North, and found really an extraordinary movement. One that was far more widespread, one that was much more improvisational, right? We tend to talk about the civil rights movement in binaries. It's integration and separation, or it's nonviolence and self-defense, or it's Martin versus Malcolm. And what I found all over the place in the North is that the movement's improvisational, right? Folks are trying different strategies and different tactics. And so, I find a school integration protest in suburban New York in the early 1960s, and the school integrationists are there. The moms are boycotting because they want better education for their kids. But supporters of Malcolm X are showing up there at a school integration protest. What's going on? This is not what I had expected to find. The movement in the North is far more centered around questions of race and class than our conventional narratives would lead us to believe. Today, you'll often hear there's a trade-off between race and class, or race trumps class, or class trumps race. Not to use the T word too much, but that we have to see them as opposed to each other. Civil rights activists in the North hardly ever saw the two as separate from each other. They saw race and class as fundamentally constitutive, as shaping and reinforcing each other, and developed strategies to try to change the urban institutions that reinforced class inequality as a vehicle for advancing African Americans and other marginalized groups. So this history of civil rights, in other words, proved to be I think really essential for challenging white innocence in the North, for recovering a really important set of activists, many of them women, who challenged every urban institution, from welfare to public education to local government, who used urban politics as a vehicle for advancement. And so I really tried as much as possible, in other words, to recover those histories and move them to the center of how we think about cities, how the center of we think about American politics. So that leads us to King. So King had been in the North before he went to Chicago. He had his first serious experience with the violent enforcement of Jim Crow in a place called Maple Shade, New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, when he was a theology student at Crozier Seminary. He and a group of his friends, classic 50s style, went on a little road trip to a diner. They wanted to have friends, wanted to hang out with their friends and have some beer and eat some food. And they went into a place called Mary's Diner in Maple Shade, New Jersey, where they were refused service. They eventually got the attention of the manager, who wielded a gun and told them to leave. Eventually, King and his friends decided to file a complaint with the state of New Jersey. It had just enacted a civil rights law that forbade discrimination in public accommodations, and ultimately the case was thrown out because the white witnesses who were in the restaurant, all of them University of Pennsylvania students, my old institution where I taught for many years, refused to testify. So King had experienced some pretty hard-hitting forms of racial segregation outside of the Deep South, a reminder that this was, as he put it, a national problem. So by the mid-'60s, he was thinking, where am I going to go? The freedom struggle needs to turn to some of these really deep structural problems that affect Black America, largely urban. And each city's got a complicated reality. New York is just too big. And he ultimately decides there are too many potential targets, it's too complicated. Philadelphia, he faces a rival. And the movement, urban movements are often pretty bitterly divided. And his rival, a man called Cecil B. Moore, basically tells King, I don't want you on my turf, get out of here. They have a kind of they shake hands and they have a little bit of a symbolic photo op kind of thing, but on the terms that King not bring, quote, the movement to Philadelphia. King goes to Detroit, and he thinks about Detroit, but Detroit's got a very robust civil rights movement, and King decides ultimately that his movement will have a greater effect elsewhere. So he goes to Chicago. Chicago is a bitterly polarized city in the 1960s. It's a place where there have been 20 plus years of violence directed at the first or second African Americans to move into white neighborhoods, where the city government has aligned itself with maintaining racial boundaries, where the city's public housing has been built in an explicitly discriminatory way. Again, stories that are playing out in other cities around the country, but also a group of local organizers who are King finds simpatico around the issue of opening up the housing market, which is what he decides to take on in Chicago. But there he discovers that, and he says something to this effect, Chicago is as violent a place as Mississippi. Right? When they march through Chicago's South Side to white working class neighborhoods, they're pelted with rocks and stones. They're called the N-word. King is really shaken by his experience in Chicago, and ultimately decides that he's going to put his energy into other things, other really important things, like launching the Poor People's Campaign in late 67 and 1968, right at the end of his career. But it's a reminder of the ways in which we have to break these binaries about thinking about North and South, or the South as being exceptional. King discovered, and as many of his counterparts did, that racial violence was commonplace in the North, but also the mechanisms of segregation were often also very subtle. They were happening through the workings of the market. They were invisible in the ways that they played out, that made the strategies of the South confronting obvious targets a really hard one, right? The targets in many northern cities weren't so obvious. They were real estate boards. They were banks who were drawing maps of cities. There were school districts bureaucratically deciding where school attendance zones would be in ways that were much more difficult to kind of put a finger on and to point and blame for the status quo. It was more difficult theater, and the civil rights movement in the South especially relied on drama. It relied on theatrical confrontation.
Let me ask two more questions, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. And my first basically amounts to whether or not you're an optimist or a pessimist. You talked at the start, sounding rather like one of the social scientists you were talking about, suggesting that liberalism itself seemed to hold the seeds of discrimination and racism, to put it baldly. If we were to go today, things seem pretty different than they were in 1967. The idea of a black mayor, no big deal anymore. A black president what's the urban now? How have things changed? And do you see this as epiphenomenal and co-optation, or do you see it as fundamental change? Where are we now relative to where we had been throughout the 20th century and before?
Yeah. So I'll begin by saying that I am pessimistic by intellect, but as someone who also has spent much of his career, his life, working for organizations committed to social change, also insistent that we can't just sit back and resign ourselves to a status quo that we find problematic or don't like. We have to organize. We have to mobilize. If there's any lesson from the freedom struggle, it's that. But urban life has changed pretty profoundly over the last 50 years. Racial inequality is not a fixed and unchanging reality. I diverge from some of the most pessimistic commentators who see a timeless and unchanging racism shaping American life. It changes. The Black freedom struggle that I write about in Sweet Land of Liberty accomplished some significant victories, and we would be remiss if we denied them. For example, and I didn't write about this in my first book, but whole sectors of the economy that were closed to anybody who wasn't white open up as a result of the race and class-based struggles, mostly in cities in the period. What are the most significant employers of black Americans in the aftermath of the 1960s? Meds and eds, government employment, and the public sector and publicly contracted work. About 40% of the black middle class in the United States works in the public sector or for companies, private companies that have significant public contracts. That didn't just happen because of a wave of a wand. It happened because of 30 plus years of sustained grassroots organizing, largely in big cities, to open up those jobs and opportunities to black workers through the political process, through protest, through taking control of unions and using the power of unions to change workplaces. And we have to acknowledge that's an accomplishment. Did it completely upend the profound economic inequalities that separate whites and non-whites in the United States? No. But is the situation better than it was in 1960 or 1940? Yes, absolutely. And we have to credit those involved in the struggle for doing so. But there are significant parts of the urban now that have not changed or have changed in problematic ways since 1967, to use that landmark date for a moment. American metropolitan areas tend still to be deeply divided by race and space. We're not as segregated in 2023 as we were in 1990, but American metropolitan areas are still segregated by race, especially black and white, around the country at very high levels. That segregation has really profound consequences in terms of access to public goods and services, in terms of access to public education, in terms of taxes you pay for those services. In other words, we have spatialized inequality, and that spatialization of inequality, the allocation of resources across fragmented metropolitan areas where real estate markets and municipal boundaries coincide with race to a great extent, is an unresolved legacy from the periods I wrote about in my two previous books. Where you live determines all sorts of things. Do you get a good public education? Do you have access to the labor market, given that most jobs have grown in metropolitan America in the last 50 or 60 years in outlying, non-central places, far away from where most non-whites live? So at one hand, we see progress. On the other hand, we see the maintenance and hardening in some places of those invisible boundaries. Now, some might respond and say, wait. We see black suburbanization. We see non-white suburbanization. I'm writing right now on Latino suburbanization. It's a project of mine looking at suburban Long Island right now. And many say now, all of a sudden, we've got a different world. It's not the crabgrass frontier. It's not a place where city equals poor, working class, people of color, and suburb equals homogeneous white. Not anymore. But in my work on different suburban places, central Long Island, Cleveland, Detroit, just to name three, I find that the patterns of segregation are replicating themselves in suburban landscapes. Most non-whites find themselves in what I call second-hand suburbs, the places that are becoming unfashionable for whites, where the housing stock is getting old, where the shopping districts are frayed, where jobs have been disappearing. And this is true pretty much in every major metropolitan area around the country. There's been a change. In those second-hand suburbs, whites don't leave as rapidly as they did in 1960 or 1970. They stay. But it's not just a matter of white flight, and this is an important intervention that some scholars have made in recent years. It's a matter of younger whites choosing not to move into communities with significant and growing non-white populations. They're not fleeing, they're just not going there anymore. Right? And so what you see in many of these suburban places, for example, is way before the population becomes majority non-white, the schools are majority non-white because younger people are not settling there, they're picking up and moving. And so what we're seeing, in other words, is a replication of some of the same patterns of residential segregation across city and suburban lines. And we err by saying America is becoming a great melting pot of diversity in suburbs. I'm finding this now in new work I'm doing on Latinx migrants. I'm working on a place in central Long Island called Islip, which is the very western edge of Suffolk County. It's about 50 miles from New York. It's way out there, mostly built between the 50s and 70s. If I plop you down there right now, blindfolded, and took off the blindfold, you wouldn't know where you were. It could be California, except there aren't palm trees. It could be, suburban Detroit. It could be Cincinnati. It could be the outskirts of Atlanta. You wouldn't know necessarily. It's a classic post-Second World War II sprawling landscape. 330,000 people live there. 100+ thousand of them are Latin American descended. The largest groups being Puerto Rican, El Salvadoran, and Dominican. What's really interesting to me about these places is that these new immigrants are landing in a landscape that's already been harshly divided by black and white. Right? They're landing into a landscape that was shaped by what I wrote about in Origins of the Urban Crisis. But they don't fall into those categories, but they're already being racialized, and their choices in the housing markets in these places are being shaped by the perception that they're outsiders, they're others, and this is a place where the housing stock is pretty uniform and pretty inexpensive. And so, so as I look out onto the urban now and the suburban now and the metropolitan now, we have to be attentive to the ways in which landscapes are changing really significantly, but also in which patterns that were solidified 50, 60, 70 years ago bear a burden that continue to shape these places.
I think I'm getting a sign that says, wrap this up.
Wrap this up. Let's let some folks ask.
All right. It's up to you. And if you don't ask questions, I'll go back to asking questions. So that's a threat. What's our?
We'd just love to give students a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, fire away, and I'll try to give shorter answers than I gave to Jim.
Yes. Hi, Tabitha.
Hi.
And why don't you introduce yourselves as you speak?
I'm a first year. I was in city politics, and now I'm here. I was indoctrinated. I was just wondering if you could talk more, if I was understanding what you were saying correctly, about the intersection of race and class, in kind of the clash, or I guess coalescence of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King-esque ideologies. because I was just kind of like confused as to like how they were intersecting and how that had to do with like class, specifically about the example with like segregation in schools.
Yeah. So good question. A lot to unpack there. So let's begin with King. King is much more radical than the King that we all learn in grade school and high school, the I Have a Dream King. King is pretty early on, beginning with his training as a theologian, criticizing capitalism for its injustices and its inequality. King is associating pretty closely early in his career and shaping strategies with trade unionists and black unionists, people like A. Philip Randolph, who are arguing that we simultaneously need to address the question of discrimination in labor markets and employment, discrimination based on color, but we also have to address the larger labor market, the larger economy that is inadequately providing jobs, particularly for the least educated and most vulnerable. In other words, we need a full employment and a fair employment economy, to use the language of the day. So in 1963, when a couple 100,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington, it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Right? Their demand was not just to have a dream and to imagine an American society where the distinctions of race were no longer poisonous. It was also to imagine a robust economy that was providing secure, well-paying jobs for working Americans, black and white, and by the mid-1960s, King and others in his wing of the movement were looking at Mexican Americans as well, and making an argument that justice required thinking systematically, or to use a term from today, intersectionally, thinking about the intersections between economic injustice and racial injustice and how the two reinforce each other. Malcolm's economic philosophy was more conservative, right? Malcolm called for black-owned businesses on the ground that we should keep they should keep their money within the community, that black businesses would be more responsive to the needs of the community. Later, at the very end of his career, before he was assassinated, as King moved away from the Nation of Islam, he began exploring some more radical or redistributionist economic ideas. But his life was cut short, and we don't know. We can only speculate as to what trajectory Malcolm's economic ideology would have taken. But under the Nation, it was very much one of self-help, of community self-determination, and when I talk about these issues to black urban audiences in particular, both of these visions are still very much alive, right? I mean, there's still a very strong rhetoric of self-help and small-based, community-oriented capitalism. This is actually a really important thread in thinking about the urban now, right, is the ways in which, since the 1960s, we've thought a lot about these small-scale interventions as potentially transformative, community economic development, community control, and so forth. But that's moving beyond King and Malcolm.
Action agencies. Yeah, yes. And don't forget to introduce yourself.
So I'm a first year. I'm actually Professor Young and Professor Self's closet. And I was curious, you mentioned something that I'm sort of pretty familiar with, given that I'm from North Carolina. So what do you think of like the general move to like meds and eds, especially in the South and like previously deindustrialized areas? Like, do you think it fits into historical patterns? To what extent do you think it maybe improves versus perpetuates inequality? Just because I feel like it's sort of a more complicated phenomenon.
Yeah, there's really good work by historians right now looking at this phenomenon. Gabe Winan at the University of Chicago, Gian McKee at the University of Virginia, my former NYU student Danny Cummings, who's now at Johns Hopkins, have all been thinking very creatively about the complexities of this new medical and service-based economy in cities. There's not one explanation for how it emerges, but significant growth in federal expenditures for hospitals and medical care, particularly beginning in the mid-1960s, play a critical role in the story. Hospitals and medical centers, unlike auto factories or textile mills are much more rooted in place. You can't really pick up a hospital and move it to a cornfield in the middle of the upper Midwest, or locate it to the U.S.-Mexican border in search of cheap labor. Right? You've got your base. You've got your constituents there. So it's sticky, as the economists say, as an economic institution. But in terms of thinking about the relationship to the urban economy, it's pretty much in every major city in the United States the only sector that is pretty steadily growing over the course of the period from the 1960s on forward. And it's growing in ways that create a whole wide range of jobs, right? From neurosurgeons to orderlies who change bedpans, right? Nurses, licensed practical nurses, up to nurses with PhDs who are overseeing research projects, right? There's a huge range of work that these institutions are creating, which is generally pretty good for urban economies. However, there are many complexities. Hospitals, like all sorts of other institutions, had discriminatory hiring and other practices kind of baked into them. But beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, the same alliance I was just talking about in the previous question of blacks and labor activists and in New York, Puerto Rican and black and labor activists began to challenge the exclusion of non-whites from generally pretty well-paying, pretty secure hospital jobs with benefits. They pushed for unionization. They pushed for inclusion, and they used the tools of the Black freedom struggle to really force open the doors that had long been closed. Remember, in big cities, in North Carolina for sure, but even in Los Angeles, Chicago, Cleveland, places like that, many hospitals didn't serve black patients at all. They had no black doctors, right? So these institutions are a really substantial target of activists in the period. And so the fact that goes back to one of the victories, right? One of the transformations that happens is that, not completely and more problematically in some places than others, but the doors get open and those kinds of jobs get created. So I did a little exercise as a local historian when I was living in Northwest Philadelphia in a majority non-white neighborhood when the 2000 census came out. I was asked by a community organization that I was working with to sum it all up for them, to look at the census data just for this neighborhood in Philadelphia and summarize it. The largest employer in my neighborhood, which was working in middle-class black primarily, was healthcare. Yeah. Right? Neighborhoods like that neighborhood did not witness the disinvestment that neighborhoods that were full of industrial workers, or they're full of another sector that was growing, poorly paid service sector workers were living in, right? And so the transformations in this sector of the economy had material consequences on the built environment or fabric of the city in ways that we really need to think about.
There's a word, I'll get to you in a second time, there's a word of both optimism and pessimism to say about this. A lot of urban hospitals, and it's worth noting that the medical system takes an extra percentage of GDP about every 3 or 4 years, so it is just a growing sector. Nothing grows like it. But the urban hospitals are in terrible shape, really on the verge of collapse. And Obamacare, the ACA, is one of the great success stories for the states, for the 40 of the 50 states that passed Medicaid expansion. They are now in solid financial shape. Yeah. The only negative thing to say about that is now vulture capitalism, what we call hedge funds and stuff. They've discovered that they can buy these hospitals and turn them into whatever sells, often real estate and condos. So they can't move to the Mexican border, but they can be bought and gutted. Yeah. So it's something we're keeping an eye on for healthcare.
I've written an article on Obama's urban policy, and it's as you would expect, given what you've heard about my work, a mixed bag, very much a mixed bag. But I consider the ACA to be actually a very successful job creation program. That may be, over the long run, its most substantial macroeconomic consequence.
Tommy.
So if you were to project out another 20 or 30 years from now, what do you think would be a critique against your work, or what do you think your work would be missing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm very candid about acknowledging what I don't do, and some of the things I didn't do, fortunately, have been rectified by other historians who have stepped in and filled the gap, or other sociologists and social scientists. And so I'm not someone who gets stuck in like what I did, and that's like, those are the glory days, and I'm just going to keep telling the same story over and over again. And so, to me, one of the most important phenomenon is immigration. Right? Immigration has profoundly remade the landscape of metropolitan America everywhere. You cannot go to old deindustrialized cities or sprawling suburbs and not see the imprint of immigration. Right? We're we have a population of foreign-born Americans today that's as high as it's been since the turn of the 20th century. In other words, immigrants make up a huge segment of the country's population, and we know pretty little about the ways in which immigration has remade urban space. In 30 years from now, we're going to know a lot more. I'm going to contribute my little drop to the bucket, right? I've done this work on Long Island. I've co-edited a book of scholars grappling with immigration and metropolitan revitalization, or how immigrants transform built environments, cityscapes, business districts. But that's small, right? I'm not ultimately going to write the next big book or series of books, but there are a lot of exciting projects happening right now that are looking at the ways in which immigration are changing space. One really good example, Andrew Sandoval Strauss, who's at Penn State, who works on Latinx history, has written a book called Barrio America, in which he makes a case for the growing Latinization of American cities because of the influx of migrants from Mexico, especially, which is what he focused on, but from other parts of Latin America, who in the process have not just brought businesses back to places that had been suffering disinvestment for a long time, but remade the physical landscape, the architecture, the environment. And I see that even in Long Island, where I'm writing, right, where you've got your typical bland post-Second World War II cheap modernist landscape or faux colonial buildings that are now painted bright yellow and red and are catering to this new population, where post-Second World War II single-family detached houses are being converted into houses for multi-family living, or for multi-generational living, in ways that nobody imagined. William Levitt in Levittown would be rolling over in his grave, imagining 3 generations of Mexican American migrants living in one of his suburban houses, or the front lawn being paved to park the 4 or 5 cars of all the people who are boarding in one of these houses. So that's maybe not exactly an answer to your question, but I think as we really come to terms with, and scholars really start paying more and more attention, I've just hit the little tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to learn about the ways in which these patterns are reshaping America, and we'll do it perhaps in a long-term and enduring way.
Good question. Yes.
Hi, I'm wondering, among the activists that you talked about, what are the differences between the role and impact of, like, let's say, Black and non-Black advocates?
Tim, can you repeat that for me?
Yeah, say it a little louder.
What would be the difference about, like, the role and the impact of Black and non-Black advocates?
Black and non-Black.
Activists.
Oh, activists. So just sorting out the role of Black and not Black, just the various kinds of so-called historically underrepresented groups across.
Activists.
Oh, activists. I'm sorry.
So like the conflict between those folks, like in the neighborhood circles.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, that's not something I've addressed, and maybe it goes back to the previous question. But there's a lot of really good scholarship looking at moments of possibility for coalition building and moments of conflict between different groups of activists, right? We tend, right, and in this current political moment especially, to lump together people of very divergent backgrounds. The term BIPOC, which as a historian I find really problematic, or the use of the term people of color, putting together groups with very different experiences, very different relationships to urban space, very different politics, very different histories, very different understandings of race and racialization, and making the assumption that there's common ground. Common ground, and I can talk about this more specifically from my own work. Common ground usually happens around single or restricted sets of issues where people find that their grievances, their problems with society are commensurate. But there's really good work on California, for example, that looks at the differences between Asian American activists, Mexican American activists, Jewish activists, white activists, black activists, in terms of what they want out of local government, what they want out of state government, what kinds of discrimination or segregation or marginalization or repression are affecting their groups most profoundly. And sometimes they merge, and sometimes they diverge pretty profoundly. One can see that, for example, over education politics. That might be the place where building cross-ethnic, cross-racial coalitions has been the most challenging, in part because of the ways in which, even if folks feel common grievances, they're often spatially separated from each other across these very balkanized landscapes. So I hope that gets here.
Yeah, it does.
Hi, welcome. First, I want to say thanks for coming today. It's been a great talk. My question was, you speak to the kind of worries about how our American urban landscape is still very segregated even today. And I know that obviously that's still a huge problem. And then at the same time, when neighborhoods become desegregated in urban spaces, a lot of the time it comes with gentrification of people being, priced out of their neighborhoods, and it can often, perpetuate the same racial divisions that segregation does. So I'm wondering how, maybe in your perspective, how could we maybe desegregate urban spaces in a way that doesn't lead to gentrification, or what's the kind of, is there some kind of necessary trade-off there, or is there a way that we can revitalize these spaces for everyone rather than just for wealthier white people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's central to how people are thinking about cities today, and I would make two related arguments in response to your question. First, gentrification is not the problem fundamentally. It's a manifestation of a far bigger structural problem that we have to address if we're going to deal with the questions of segregation and especially the inequitable distribution of resources across metropolitan space. And integration and gentrification seldom go together hand in hand, right? The two aren't really. So let me begin with the first, right? Because right now, when I speak to groups about cities, I recently spoke to the Detroit City Planning Committee. Everyone wanted to talk about gentrification. Gentrification is a phenomenon. It's real. It's affected nearly every city in the United States and many in the world. It won't take you long to walk, a short distance from here and see signs of gentrification. But gentrification is a drop in the bucket in most American metropolitan areas. It's not the primary driver of inequality in housing markets or of opportunity or of segregation by class. It's new. At least the extent of it is new, and that is eye-opening. We talk a lot about gentrification because gentrification is, to generalize a little bit, about people like us, right? When we travel from city to city, we end up in the gentrified neighborhoods because that's where highly educated, food-loving, hip cocktail-loving, art gallery-loving people who don't want to live in bland suburbia find themselves, right? But the real problem, and gentrification is often a symptom of this, is the profound lack of affordable housing options in our metropolitan areas writ large. Gentrification can contribute to that, right, by raising housing prices in certain neighborhoods so that folks who've lived there for a long time or who might want to move there can't afford to anymore. But high housing prices and unaffordability are especially acute in neighborhoods that are nowhere near gentrification, right? Some of the most unaffordable neighborhoods in our metropolitan areas are largely poor and working class, largely non-white areas. Big swaths of North Philadelphia, most of Detroit. Most of Detroit's gentrification, to go back to my example, happens in 7.9 square miles of a 139 square mile city. Right? So, but there's very little affordable housing available and good quality affordable housing available. The sociologist Matthew Desmond, who's just done a big book on poverty, wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book on eviction a few years ago, in which he found that landlords renting properties in poor neighborhoods have a higher profit margin than renting in better off neighborhoods, because there's a lot of profit to be made in making the poor pay a lot. So you pay relatively little for a property, you charge relatively high prices, and it prices folks out. It makes them have to resort to less adequate housing. It leads to evictions. So the real big question facing our metropolitan areas is the fact that there's very little affordable housing available. There's even less affordable housing available in the outlying and suburban areas because of zoning laws that have largely excluded multiple family housing and smaller scale housing, smaller lot size, accessory housing, et cetera. So the really, really big crisis that our cities are facing today is a crisis of housing affordability. Let me say one last thing about gentrification. One thing that gentrification does is it leads to the channeling of governmental and private sector resources to economic development in small places. So Detroit's 7.9 square miles have gotten a ton of money recently, as have gentrifying parts of North Philadelphia, as have gentrifying parts of Providence, right? There are tax incentives, tax breaks, special deals that are made, big private sector financing coming to these neighborhoods, and that money is not going to outlying neighborhoods. So it's not necessarily a story of gentrification crowding out folks. It's gentrification hoarding capital in a way that profoundly disadvantages the neighborhoods that need it the most, right? I mean, really, downtown Philadelphia, I lived in Philadelphia for 27 years. I still miss it terribly. But Center City, Philadelphia today is booming. It's gentrified. It's great. But you go a mile to the north, 2 miles to the north, and you're in places that have scarcely changed. They've gotten worse in the last 40 or 50 years. By spending all of our time thinking about the coffee shops and thinking about the cultural politics of hipsters imposing their values on urban neighborhoods, the way we often talk about gentrification ultimately misses what I think is a really big picture, which is the inequitable distribution of power and economic resources across metropolitan space. That, I think, is maybe the bottom line takeaway from my book Origins and from my more recent work. The question of cities is ultimately a question of the future of the city, or of urbanism, to go back to Sandy's charge, is thinking about the ways in which power and resources are inequitably distributed across space, across place, and what kinds of institutions, what kinds of economic incentives, what kinds of financial and capital policies lead to that inequitable distribution of resources across space. And so gentrification is a symptom of that, for sure. But it's not the primary cause.
Wow, great answer. Why don't we've only got a couple minutes, so let me just take all the questions on the floor and you get a last statement,
Okay.
although that was a great last statement, so you can punt. You had a question, or has it been answered?
Paul from the history department, and I'm not a modern historian nor
We don't have these. I'm sad to say I'm losing my hearing. And masks make it really tough for me.
I don't do your kind of history, so I don't. This coming from ignorance, and also I've missed all the previous sessions, and maybe this has been answered before. But I'm intrigued with the study you're doing now in suburban Long Island. You mentioned, they have to pave the front yard to put in space for the 4 cars they need, and that reminds me of a question I've had for a while now, which is, how is enduring car dependency, especially in the suburbs, factoring into what you're seeing in your city, and the fact that these suburbs are having a renewal, especially these far exurbs that have remained more affordable, but that's not come with a commensurate improvement in reliable public transit. And so, people who are in the bottom 2-3 quintiles of income in the U.S. are spending a larger proportion of their income on cars out of obligation, and what they're not.
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you slip off your mask so we can hear you and just give it to us very quickly?
Yeah, I just want to have like a follow up on the immigration factor you mentioned. Do you think like this will kind of be pure to like those metropolitics controversy issue you mentioned? Do you think that could be like immigration could bring like a positive solution for this, or like I have read some like other economic theory that say like this kind of population diversity usually create like this scenario even worse. So like I want to see like your opinion on that, since you mentioned like immigration is going to be like a key factor for future urban development.
And one last one from over there. Remove your mask, but just address the
Respectfully, I
question.
don't feel comfortable doing that, but I think you'll be able to.
Okay, yeah.
I'm Matthew. I'm a fourth-year doctoral student here in American Studies. I work with Sandy Zip. And I've been so motivated, Professor Sugrue, during my work by this claim at the center of origins of the urban crisis. And you said this like so beautifully at the beginning of the conversation, like this is baked into liberalism, that particular claim. And so I'm curious how you see your work relating to a wide body, and I think a growing body of scholarship and political activism that really takes up that charge, that liberalism and capitalism, nothing more and nothing less than those full systems are the problem, and that see solutions or try to see solutions in something that looks like the word abolition in the 21st century, right? Looks like a really concerted effort to undo and remake these systems rather than just imagine how policy or how certain types of changes might see them reformed. I see inspiration in your work for that, but it hasn't quite come up today. So I'm just sort of curious where you see your work intersecting with those movements.
Great question.
Yeah, really good questions. I'll talk about the cars really fast. And I'll start personally in saying that for the first time since I've been in my 20s, I don't own a car anymore.
Hey.
It is glorious. But I live in a place that has a transit system that makes it possible for me to get around mostly without a car. Suburban places and dependency on cars is, an enormous problem, and it's one that we haven't adequately addressed. I mean, there have been calls for transit-oriented development, for example, of clustering housing and building dense housing near train or other transit connections and links. Some places have been trying it at larger scales than others, but it's essentially an effort to deal with the tyranny of the automobile. But to go back to central Long Island, one of the really interesting spatial patterns that I noticed doing my research there was post-Second World War II suburbia is not built for pedestrians, right? There are very few sidewalks. There aren't bike lanes. But what I noticed in going around Islip, this town where I'm doing research, is there are pathways along the sides of the major roads where people are walking, right? And it turned into little dirt paths. People are adapting, in other words, to and in everyday ways, responding to the inadequacy of the landscape for any form of transportation other than the automobile. Bikes, right? You saw bikes in suburban cul-de-sacs with kids riding around when Levitt and others were envisioning their post-Second World War II suburbia. But out in Islip, I saw a lot of people riding bikes in pretty hazardous conditions on roads that don't have shoulders, that have lots and lots of traffic. But you've got working class folks who are cobbling together, livings, and having a car is super expensive. So riding the inadequate public transit there and bicycling are becoming, are essential. They're ways of people coping with the situation, and they're remaking the landscape in ways that demand that planners and others think about how we can build on these adaptations, right? Where are the paths? Let's build some sidewalks. Let's curb lanes to allow for more bike traffic, and let's build an adequate transit system, which is a huge problem. We can go into the politics of public transit in great detail. I won't here, but suffice it to say, our public transit system, by comparison to nearly every other country in the West, and many countries in many poorer countries in the world, is woefully inadequate. I spend a lot of time in Brazil these days, and the public transit system there is way better than the public transportation system in places like Rio or Sao Paulo than in metros like New York or Los Angeles. They're large counterparts here in the U.S. So that's one. The immigration question. I'm forgetting the exact contours of it now.
Is it? Do you see it as a potential salve for some of the challenges of urban?
Yeah. So is immigration a potential salve? Yes, it can be. Certainly in places that have seen disinvestment and a decline in tax bases as a result of disinvestment. Immigrant-generated businesses have been essential to shoring up the fiscal status of cities, and so I think that's a really important one. Again, though, we have to come back to the question of power and the distribution of resources across space. And I don't see, like some of my counterparts in urban planning or in urban government do, as incubating small businesses as the savior of the city. I think we have to think much more comprehensively about creating the kinds of jobs that are going to provide opportunity for folks who are still really vulnerable. We don't think much about jobs or job creation except for in the most kind of macro ways and often very superficial ways. And we need to think much more systematically because the job crisis remains a really serious one. The service sector and the gig economy are now among the most important employers in our major cities, and they're bad jobs. Yeah. They don't have benefits, they're insecure, they're precarious, they're unregulated, you're subject to the whims of your employers, and now new surveillance technologies that are monitoring your activities and further hindering your dignity and your freedom as a worker. All these need to be addressed. And so again, yes, immigration has had beneficial consequences for many urban places, but alone it's one part of a bigger answer. Giant question. Let me answer it by saying we have to be clear-eyed about what works and doesn't work, right? And we have to look at institutions that we may have a deep political commitment to or investment in, and look at where they're not working, where they haven't worked, where they're failing, and use our tools as urbanists, as social scientists, as historians, as analysts, to diagnose the problem and to think about ways out. Historians, we're not very good about thinking about ways out. That's not usually what we do well. Then again, a lot of other scholars don't do a very good job at it either. Even sometimes they pretend to do. I mean, read the ideas of economists that flash into kind of exciting, wow, this is going to change everything and how it's going to work, and then a few years later, well, it's kind of forgotten and we moved on to the next fad. So I am optimistic because we've seen really significant urban-based social movements in the last decade or so that are thinking structurally and systematically about not just the origins of the problems like I've written about and described, but also thinking about ways of imagining an alternative future. Most of those imaginations are still conceptual, they're prefigurative. We don't know whether they're going to work or not. But we can't come up with new institutions and new ideas until we have folks who begin imagining them, right? So I think the first necessary step is playing around with concepts like abolition or reparation, right? I think right now, both of those are very hard to imagine ever being enacted in the current political climate. But change, as we know from my history of the civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement from the 1920s all the way up to the present, change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen fast. But it only happens if folks begin imagining alternatives. And some of those alternatives will fall to the dust heap of history, and some of those alternatives will eventually take shape in new demands, new ideas for institutions. But ultimately, we do have to think about institutions. I mean, I am at core an institutionalist. I mean, right? The best ideas don't last for very long unless we think about ways of embodying them, implementing them, and acting on them. And I think all too often, on the left in particular, urbanists and others, we think a lot about the new idea, and we don't think so much about the actual nitty-gritty of delivering on it. And we need to think a lot more about the nitty-gritty, even if it's sometimes boring. Process, institutions, these all matter. So that's maybe a good place for me to call it an end.
And on imagination, not boring. Join me in thanking Tom for a wonderful...
And thank you, Jim, for your excellent questions, and to you for your excellent questions.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. And I just want to remind folks that if you want a chance to speak more informally with Tom Sugrue, starting at 5 o'clock in Max 109, right next door, the Urban Studies Conference Room, Tom will be happy to talk with you more about these issues and any others if you'd like to hang out a bit. I think there'll be some drinks and things over there, too.
Oh, good.
And, yes. Well, not those kind of drinks.
Oh. Bummer.
Apparently that's all going to be right out on the lawn. So anyway, so, come hang out if you want. And otherwise, thank you very much. And let's give another round of applause to Professor Morone.
Thank you.